Hello everyone, I'm Justin and this is everything you need to know before watching Halloween Ends, releasing October 14th. If you end up enjoying this video and want to see more from us, then make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. About 44 years ago was the release of the very first movie in the Halloween franchise, which has since spawned various sequels and reboots, branching into multiple universes in hopes of reinventing the franchise. But it all looks to be finally coming to an end on October 14th with the release of Halloween Ends, which will likely pit Michael Myers against Laurie Strode for the final time. So before the new movie's release, we'll be taking a look back at everything that's gone down in the current timeline in which Halloween Ends is a part of, as although it's the franchise's 12th installment, it doesn't share the same continuity as all of them. From what I've gathered, there's currently 5 different timelines separating the Halloween canon, with the first of them including the 1st, 2nd, 4th, 5th, and 6th films, while the next one only includes Halloween 3, the only installment to not even feature Michael Myers. The third timeline then cuts out multiple of the original 6 films, with it only being the 1st, 2nd, 7th, and 8th installments. And the 4th is just a complete reboot directed by Rob Zombie, containing Halloween released in 2007 and Halloween 2 released in 2009. And the 5th and final timeline, which is the only one we'll be talking about today, is the current timeline, featuring the original 1978 Halloween, the 2018 Halloween, Halloween Kills released last year, and the soon-to-be released Halloween Ends. I suggest, if you haven't already, that you go watch each Halloween film released to date, so you can go experience its highs and lows on your own. But if you're just looking for a quick refresher to prepare you for the new movie, then you've come to the right place. To start, we have to go all the way back to Halloween night 1963 in Haddonfield, Illinois, where we witness a 6-year-old Michael Myers commit his first murder through his point of view, as he repeatedly stabs his sister Judith Myers with a knife. When his parents learn of what he's done, they send him off to the Smiths Grove Sanitarium, a mental health facility and detainment center for the criminally insane, where he ends up being kept for the next 15 years until Halloween Eve in 1978, when Dr. Sam Loomis, accompanied by Nurse Marion Chambers, arrives to transfer him to another facility. But when they pull up to Smiths Grove, they're shocked to see the inmates wandering around outside. So Loomis, frightened that Michael may have escaped as well, gets out of the car to look for him. But just then, Michael leaps on top of the vehicle and attacks Marion through the window, forcing her to exit the car and allowing him to enter and drive off. The next day, back in Haddonfield, we're introduced to a teenage Laurie Strode, the daughter of a local realtor who's looking to sell the old Myers house. We're also soon introduced to a young boy named Tommy Doyle, who Laurie's actually planning to spend her Halloween babysitting, and who joins her in dropping the keys off at the Myers house as she was asked to do so by her father. Tommy doesn't want to get too close to the home though, since he's heard some awful things happen there. But Laurie doesn't seem too worried about any of that, although maybe she should be, as from inside the home we can see a shape stalking her, and soon he's stalking her from outside the home as well, with him watching over her out the window of her school as she's walking home with her friends Linda and Annie, and even from out the window of her home. While Michael's been getting all spooky around Laurie, Loomis has made his way to Haddonfield, though not before coming across another of Michael's victims, that being a mechanic who Michael had stripped of his jumpsuit. Once in town, Loomis heads over to the cemetery, where he gets confirmation of Michael's arrival after finding Judith Myers' headstone no longer in the ground. Laurie, meanwhile, has joined Annie on a car ride to smoke up, and the two are soon met by Annie's father, the town sheriff Lee Brackett, as he's looking into a robbery of a hardware store after a Halloween mask, a rope, and a couple of knives are stolen. Following their departure, Sheriff Brackett is then approached by Dr. Loomis, who informs him of Michael's escape and arrival in Haddonfield, and manages to get Brackett to bring him to the old Myers house. Inside the home, they find a dead dog, which Loomis insinuates Michael may have eaten, and he begins explaining more about what he'd learned over the 15 years he'd been looking after Michael.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Michael, meanwhile, has now begun stalking Annie outside of the Wallace home, in which Annie's babysitting a young girl named Lindsay Wallace, while Laurie is headed to the Doyle house to babysit Tommy. Annie soon comes over to the Doyle house as well to drop off Lindsay, so she can go hook up with her boyfriend Paul. But upon entering her car, Annie is attacked by Michael, who slowly begins strangling her to death until she starts honking the car horn, so he quickly puts her down with a throat slash. He then continues adding to his kill count with their friend Linda and her boyfriend Bob, who'd headed over to the Wallace house expecting to see Annie babysitting, but since no one appeared to be home, they instead just went upstairs to get it on. After a quick round, Bob headed downstairs to grab some beers, and ended up being attacked by Michael, who came bursting out of a closet and began strangling him, before closing out his kill with a stab through the chest with a knife that left Bob hanging against the wall. He then made his way upstairs wearing a bedsheet over his head and pretending to be Bob, so that Linda's suspicion wouldn't be raised when he went to kill her, which he did by strangling her with the phone cord while she was on the phone with Laurie. Although believing it to be them just messing with her at first, Laurie quickly becomes concerned by by the noises being made over the phone. So after putting the kids to bed, she goes over to the home to see if her friends are okay. As she enters the Wallace house, Loomis, who's been keeping an eye on the neighborhood in case Michael showed up, finally gains confirmation that Michael's nearby when discovering Marion's car parked down the block. Meanwhile, Lori discovers more horrifying developments. As the deeper she searches through the home, the more of her friends' corpses she finds. The first of which being Annie's, laid across a bed next to the Judith Myers headstone. After coming across Linda and Bob's bodies as well, Lori runs to the stairs fearfully. But when taking a moment to catch her breath, Michael appears through the shadows and slashes her in the shoulder, causing her to fall down the stairs. She manages to get back to her feet though, and run back to the Doyle house. And after having Tommy and Lindsay lock themselves in the upstairs bedroom, she attempts to call the police, but is unable to since the phone lines are down. She then notices one of the windows is open, so she arms herself with a knitting needle and waits for Michael's next attack, which comes in the form of another stab attempt with his knife. But luckily, he misses completely and she's able to knock him out with a needle to the neck. Believing the boogeyman's been defeated, she heads upstairs to comfort the kids.
You can't kill the boogeyman.
And Tommy's proven right, with Michael appearing behind them, so Lori rushes the kids into one room while she hides in the closet of another. Michael decides to follow after her rather than the kids, and punches through the closet door. But Lori's able to grab hold of a wire hanger and knock him out once again, this time with a stab to the eye. She then has the kids run to a neighbor's house to call the police, and as the kids are on their way out of the home, Loomis hears their screams of terror, and believing them to have been caused by Michael, he enters the house. After believing to have defeated him once again, Lori sat down to catch her breath. But behind her, Michael once again regains consciousness and hits an Undertaker sit-up before grabbing and beginning to strangle her. She's able to thwart his attack though by taking off his mask, and as he's putting it back on, Loomis appears and fires his gun at him 6 times, which ultimately sends Michael falling off of the balcony to the ground below. But when Loomis looks over the balcony to see Michael laying there, Michael is nowhere to be found. He's quickly spotted by a young officer though, named Frank Hawkins, who orders him to stop, but when that doesn't work, he's forced to fire at Michael multiple times, but he misses each shot before losing sight of him altogether. He's then joined by his partner, Pete McCabe, who's revealed to have actually known Michael when they were kids, explaining how his mom would force him to go over to the Myers house to play, but Michael would just spend the whole time staring out his sister's window. As they continue their search on foot, other officers circle the block to send all the kids still trick-or-treating back home, with one of those kids being Lonnie Elam, who was seen bullying Tommy Doyle earlier during school, and again later messing around near the Myers house, where he once again ends up while running home, tripping and falling across the street from it. As he tries to get back to his feet though, Michael Myers appears behind him, so he curls up into a ball and begins apologizing for the bad things he's done, in hopes of being spared, which appears to have worked, as when he looks up, he's instead met by McCabe and Hawkins, who make their way inside of Michael's home while Lonnie rushes to his. Once inside, they search throughout the place, but find no sign of Michael being there, until he suddenly bursts out of a closet and begins strangling McCabe. Hawkins attempts to stop him, but is once again forced to fire, and although he does land a shot this time, it ends up being through his partner's neck. Michael then makes his way out of the house, and Hawkins continues shooting at him, but still doesn't manage to hit him, and is left to watch as McCabe dies from his wound. Meanwhile, outside, Michael's quickly surrounded by multiple officers, as well as Dr. Loomis, who looks to kill him once and for all, but before he can, he's stopped by Hawkins, as he believes there shouldn't be any more bloodshed. And so, Michael's instead taken back to the Smiths Grove Sanitarium and locked up for the next 40 years. Now, in 2018, we're introduced to a couple of true crime podcasters, Aaron Corey and Dana Haynes, who've traveled to Smiths Grove in hopes of interviewing Michael before they once again attempt to move him to another facility that night, which appears to be upsetting news for his new doctor, Ranbir Sartain, a former student of Dr. Loomis, who's been watching over and treating Michael since Loomis's death in the 1990s. But their interview doesn't go as they'd hoped, as even after showing him his original William Shatner mask, they're unable to get him to talk. So they instead head over to the home of Lori herself, who now lives in a heavily fortified house with a giant fence and various locks on her doors, and who only allows them inside after they offer her some money for the interview. But once again, they don't get the information they'd been hoping for, as she quickly kicks them out once they bring up how she lost custody of her daughter Karen when she was just 12 years old, due to the state believing she was an unfit mother. But Lori claims she was just trying to prepare her for the horrors of this world. And we soon meet a now adult Karen, along with her husband Ray and their daughter Allison, who seems to have a good relationship with her grandmother, despite Karen and Lori growing distant. Through Allison, we also meet some of her friends, such as Vicky, Vicky's boyfriend Dave, Oscar, and Allison's boyfriend Cameron, who she's taking to meet her family that night at dinner. She also invited Lori to join them, but Lori ends up running late so she can watch as Michael's bus exits the facility. And once she does does get there, she shows up drunk and crying, creating even more of a divide between her and Karen. Meanwhile, we see a man and his son out on the road as they're headed on a hunting trip, but their drive is soon interrupted by the Smiths Grove bus flipped over on the side of the road and the inmates all wandering around. So the dad exits the car to see what happened and has his son call the cops, but after his dad's gone for a while, the boy decides to get out of the car as well to look for him. But the only person he ends up finding is Dr. Sartain.
Don't shoot!
In shock, the kid bolts back to his truck, but just as he gets it started, Michael Myers emerges from the back seat and kills him. Michael then makes his escape just moments before Deputy Frank Hawkins arrives on the scene, although he does find a wounded Dr. Sartain and transports him to the hospital. Michael, meanwhile, remains unfound into the next morning and begins stalking his next victims, Dana and Aaron, who he follows all the way to a gas station where he first kills a mechanic and steals his jumpsuit before killing the remaining employees, and lastly killing the two podcasters, first by bashing Aaron's skull into a bathroom stall door before cracking Dana's neck. He then retrieves his OG mask from their trunk and prepares for another Halloween night killing spree, which he kickstarts later by killing one woman with a hammer and another with a kitchen knife. As he continues wandering throughout Haddonfield, Allison's friend Vicky begins babysitting a kid named Julian.
If I had some other kind of babysitter, she'd be reading me a story. I wouldn't be up clipping my nasty ass toenails.
She eventually gets him tucked in for bed, which allows her to bring Dave over so they can get to business. But that's quickly interrupted when Julian comes rushing downstairs, claiming that there's a boogeyman in his room. So Vicky heads up there to check it out, and is promptly attacked and killed by Michael, before he then also kills Dave and leaves him hanging on the wall, similar to his murder of Bob years ago. Once the incident's called into the police, Deputy Hawkins is the first to arrive, along with Lori, who'd heard of the disturbance over her police radio scanner. But they're just a bit too late, with Hawkins once again missing every shot he takes as Michael exits the home, although Lori does manage to land a shot from behind before losing sight of him. Meanwhile, Allison's been hanging out at her high school Halloween party with Cameron and Oscar, but her enjoyment swiftly dissipates after finding Cameron kissing another girl. So she decides to leave and walks home with Oscar, but things quickly get awkward after he reveals he actually has a crush on her and attempts to kiss her. So she instead just walks home alone. But shortly after she leaves Oscar behind, Michael shows up and attacks him, landing multiple stabs to the back as he tries to climb away over a fence. After hearing Oscar's screams of terror in the distance, Allison began heading back to make sure he was alright, but all she ends up finding is a dead Oscar in the shape her grandmother was constantly talking about. So she runs to a neighbor's house and calls the police, who sent Hawkins to pick her up. Also riding alongside Hawkins now is Dr. Sartain, who's recovered enough to join him in his search for Michael as they drop Allison off at Lori's house, where her family is already waiting, since it turns out Lori's house was specifically made for a situation like this, including a bunker filled with weapons and other survival items. But while on his way there, Hawkins sees Michael walking down the street and decides to run him over with his car, which incapacitates Michael for the moment. Hawkins wants to take the opportunity to rectify the mistake he made years ago and finish him off for good. But Sartain doesn't want Michael dead, still wanting to try and understand the mind of evil. So before Hawkins can follow through with it, Sartain pulls out a penknife and stabs him in the neck. And he then drags a still unconscious Michael into the back seat and begins making his way to Lori's house for a reunion, believing his pursuit of her could be what keeps him alive. It's revealed here that the bus crash earlier was actually caused by Sartain, and that his plan all along has been to bring Michael to Lori. On the way there though, Allison's able to get him to pull over by claiming Michael had spoken to her, which is something Sartain has been obsessed with hearing himself. And as he's distracted with this, Michael regains consciousness and viciously attacks him, before dragging him out into the street and killing him with a stomp to the head. He then becomes distracted with the two police officers assigned to guard the entrance to Lori's property, and as he goes to kill them, Allison's able to make her escape. So having killed the officers, Michael shifts his attention to Lori's house, and first kills Ray by strangling him to death outside after distracting him with the dead cops' corpses. Lori soon becomes aware of Michael's arrival and sends Karen into the bunker while she waits by the door, but this just leaves her open to an attack as Michael punches through the door and nearly crushes her skull, but she's able to thwart his attack with a shotgun shot to the hand. She then also heads into the bunker as Michael enters the home, but quickly blows their cover by attempting to shoot him from beneath the floor. So she heads back upstairs and looks through each room of the home until he eventually comes out of the shadows and manages to land a stab to her stomach before tossing her off the balcony. Immediately following this, Allison finally makes her way into the house, which distracts Michael long enough for Lori to vanish. So he instead attempts to find a way into the bunker, which now Karen and Allison are hiding in, and does so by tearing off its cover. But just as he shows himself at the top of the steps, Karen lands a shot to the side of his face, which gives Lori an opening to attack him from the shadows and knock him into the bunker with a frying pan, forcing Allison and Karen to hurry up the steps. And once the three have made it out, Karen pulls a lever to reveal that that the basement was actually built to be a trap for Michael all along, as gas starts pumping into the house and Laurie throws a road flare down into the bunker before the 3 Strode women make their escape. As they make their way to the hospital to get Laurie patched up though, they see fire trucks heading towards her burning home. The firefighters quickly arrive there and attempt to put out the fire, but while doing so, one of them falls through the floor and into the bunker, where he's met and killed by Michael, who then exits the house now engulfed in flames and makes quick work of the rest of the firemen, before continuing to add to his kill count with Laurie's closest neighbors, Sandra and Phil, the former of whom is killed with a light tube through the neck, while the latter is killed by multiple knife stabs to the back. With Michael back on the streets and Laurie stuck in the hospital, let's reintroduce ourselves to some previous characters that are now all grown up, those being Marion Chambers, Lindsay Wallace, Lonnie Elam, and Tommy Doyle, who've been spending their Halloween at Mick's Bar celebrating their survival of Michael Myers' attack on the town back in 1978, unaware that he's back to killing once again. Lonnie soon rushed away from the party though, after receiving a call from his son, Cameron, who after leaving his Halloween party earlier, stumbled upon Deputy Hawkins lying in the street and helped get him an ambulance. So Lonnie heads out to pick him up, while the rest of the gang soon learns of Michael's return and recent killing spree. The group had also befriended this couple dressed as a doctor and nurse, Marcus and Vanessa, who happened to be the same couple seen entering their car during Michael's first couple of kills that night. And upon realizing he'd attacked their neighborhood, they plan to return home. But as Vanessa enters her car, she sees a man who she thinks is Michael in the back seat. So she heads back into the bar to ask for help, and it comes in the form of Tommy Doyle with Old Huckleberry, that he swings at the windshield and windows of the car, prompting the man inside to floor it and subsequently crash, though he's able to escape before the group can find him. But it turns out the man inside wasn't Michael Myers, but was actually another escaped inmate, Lance Tivoli. Meanwhile, Laurie has completed surgery and is now recovering as Hawkins is rushed into the emergency room himself. And following his arrival, Sheriff Barker and Deputy Graham arrive to give Karen and Allison the bad news that Michael is still alive. Upon learning this, Allison storms out before being stopped by Cameron, who apologizes for what he did at the party and asks her to join him, his dad, and Tommy in rallying some people together to go after Michael, and she agrees. Also joining them are Marcus, Vanessa, Marion, and Lindsay, though they decide to split up and drive separate from Lonnie, Cameron, and Allison, while Tommy heads out on his own to find others that want to help. As Lindsay's group is out circling the neighborhood, they notice 2 kids still playing at the park, so she exits the car to warn them that they may be in danger, but the kids don't think much of it until Michael suddenly appears next to Lindsay's car, holding another kid's bloody Halloween mask. He then climbs on top of the car and tries to attack Marion just as he did 40 years ago, but he finds it to be much more difficult this time around, with her having a gun as protection. She continues firing at him each attempt he makes, but this eventually leads to her running out of bullets, which in turn gives him an opening to repeatedly stab her in the chest. Marcus tries to help her by strangling him with the stethoscope he'd been wearing as part of his costume, but it appears to have no effect on Michael, who puts him down with a stab through the eye. Vanessa tries to take out Michael next, firing a gun multiple times from outside the car, but when she aims her gun into the window, Michael kicks open the door, causing the gun to turn back on her as she shoots, and for her to shoot herself in the head. As he's admiring his work, Lindsay appears and whacks him over the head with a bag of bricks, but this also seems to have no effect on him, and he begins strangling her to death. Luckily though, she's able to break out of it by taking off his mask, and as he readjusts it, she runs into and hides in the woods, well enough that Michael decides to just leave. And eventually, Tommy, Lonnie, Cameron, and Allison arrive to pick her up. Back at the hospital, Laurie is finally woken up and is met by Karen, who decides not to tell her that Michael's still alive for now, and the two are soon joined by a recovering Frank, as he's brought into the same room. Once he wakes up, he and Laurie begin reflecting on their pasts, and it's revealed that they used to actually have a thing for each other in high school, but their time reminiscing is soon interrupted by Tommy, who's began rallying the citizens inside the hospital to fight against and kill Michael Myers, including the likes of former Sheriff Lee Bracken, who now works as a security guard at said hospital. The police try to calm everyone down, but it looks like they'll have a riot on their hands, especially once Tommy bursts into Laurie's room and informs her of everything that's happened. And although Karen tries to keep her in bed, Laurie forces herself up and injects herself with the nearest pain-relieving drug she can find. And things soon become even more chaotic as Lance Tivoli enters the hospital asking for help for the wound he'd sustained after crashing the car earlier. But the town civilians believe him to be an unmasked Michael Myers, since he's wearing a Smith's Grove jumpsuit. so they chase after him. The only people that realize he's not actually Michael are Laurie and Karen, but they're unable to gain the mob's attention nor stop them, and Laurie ends up having to go back to her room after reopening her wound while knocking down a guy that tried shoving her out of the way. So Karen attempts to help Tivoli on her own, managing to make it to him before anyone else, and after gaining his trust, she locks him in a hallway to hopefully keep him protected. But as she tries to reason with them, the mob still won't listen and begin breaking down the doors, so Tivoli decides to end his own life, leaping out of the window to the ground below. Back in Laurie's hospital room, she expresses her guilt over what's happened to the people of Haddonfield thanks to her feud with Michael. But Hawkins explains that it's actually his fault, since he chose to stop Loomis from executing Michael after his original killing spree. Still, Laurie says she has to be the one to find and kill him, believing his pursuit is what drives him. But Hawkins doesn't believe that to be true, pointing out how it was Sartain that brought upon their earlier reunion, and explains that to him, it seems that Michael just wants to go home. And it looks like he may be right, as throughout this, Michael's actually begun making his way back to the old Myers house, where a married couple, Big John and Little John, currently live. We saw the two Johns earlier being tricked by the kids later found by Lindsay at the park and getting their candy stolen. So when they hear some knocking at their front and back doors, they just think it's some more kids messing with them. So they go outside to scare them, but they see no one there, and they're soon frightened upon realizing someone has entered the house through the back, with that someone being Michael, of course, who attacks and kills Big John with a stab through the armpit and a gouging of the eyeballs, before then repeatedly stabbing Little John to death as well. Lonnie, Cameron, and Allison also realize Michael's plans to return home, but Lonnie refuses to let them go inside and decides he's gonna enter alone, though they soon follow him in anyways after hearing a gun fire from inside. They're unable to find him or Michael at first, but after finding Big and Little John's corpses, Cameron also finds his father's dead body stuffed into the attic, before Michael suddenly bursts out of a closet, rushes towards Cameron, and stabs him multiple times in the torso. Allison attempts to help, landing a few stabs of her own, but they appear ineffective and he ends up chucking her down the stairs, resulting in her breaking her leg, before he then finishes off Cameron by smashing his head through the banister and ultimately breaking his neck. He then approaches Allison at the bottom of the steps and catches her stab attempt, but before he can turn the knife back onto her, Karen shows up with a pitchfork and stabs him through the back with it. She then takes his mask and lures him into the street, where Tommy, Brackett, and the rest of the mob are waiting for him with various weapons that they beat him to the ground with, and leave him prone for a final attack from Karen, who stabs him through the neck with his knife before exiting to comfort Allison. But before Brackett can execute him once and for all, Michael jumps back into action and slashes Lee's throat before tearing through the rest of the mob, lastly killing Tommy with a stab through the chest. And from the hospital, Laurie explains how Michael's been able to survive everything he's gone through, believing that the more he kills, the more he transcends into something impossible to defeat. And this appears to be true, as Karen, believing they finally won, heads back into the house to stare out the window, just as Michael was known to do when he was a boy, before he suddenly appears behind her and stabs her over and over until she's left lifeless on the floor. And that was everything you need to know before watching Halloween Ends. If you enjoyed the video, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And also let us know what your favorite Halloween universe and or movie is in the comments below. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.